We've been studying the encounter of the woman of Samaria at the well with the Lord Jesus Christ, and how slowly he shocks her by showing her that not only does she not know who he is, but he knows everything about who she is, even about the most private details of her life. And as this is sinking in and registering with her for the first time, she says, "Sir," this is in verse 19, "I can see that you're a prophet." Now immediately she tries to shift to a theological question. It's an important theological question. Let's give her as much credit as we can. She had already introduced a biblical subject when she brought up the subject of Jacob, a common ancestor of the Jews and the Samaritans, and talked about the fact that this is actually Jacob's well right here. But also there could be added pressure on her to shift the topic to theology because he had gotten very personal. And the Christian life is about the life of God that we call theology, and our own private life, which we call morality. And the two are connected. A person can have a life that's pretty moral and pretty strict and pretty high, and yet not know God, not believe the theological truths about Christianity, and that person is lost. And a person can be very correct about theology and still be living a life of moral anarchy. And even though it's possible theoretically to be a Christian and have your private life all messed up, practically it's not likely that a person can live like that for very long and really know the Lord, because the Holy Spirit would be so uncomfortable with that lifestyle. It would be impossible after a while. So here are two things here: what she's doing privately, what she believes publicly about, for instance, the controversy between the Jews and the Samaritans about who God is and how he should be worshiped. And that's what she brings up. After the Jews banned the Samaritans from the temple in Jerusalem, if they were going to worship at all, they had to find some place to worship. And one reason they stopped believing the prophets and the writings, and they only concentrated on the first 5 books of the Bible, is because the place where they lived was important in the first 5 books of the Bible. Jerusalem only became important after David conquered it, after he was on the throne for 7 years. He drove the Jebusites out and took over Jerusalem. So the Samaritans evolved their own worship at Mount Gerizim, near this well, while the Jews had their temple down in Jerusalem. So she now wants to talk about theology, and she asks the question, "Our fathers worshiped on this mountain, but you say that Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." John 4, verse 20. Now let me say something else. Unbelievers love it that religious people disagree. And unbelievers don't necessarily understand the difference between religious people. Okay, you've got one group of people who believes that a woman should cover her head or even her face. You've got another group of people who believe that you should educate your child at home and do homeschooling. You've got one group of people who have 5 times a day that you pray. You've got another group of people who maybe don't allow rock music in their home. You've got one group of people who try to go to Mecca once in their lifetime. You've got another group of people who try to go to church 3 times a week. The unbeliever can't tell the difference between Christians and Muslims. It all sounds like fanaticism to him. It all sounds like he's taking, that we evangelicals, Protestant evangelicals, and the Muslims are taking religion too far. We're letting it dominate our lives. We're becoming fanatical. That's the way the unbeliever views religious people. Now, when the unbeliever discovers that Muslims and Christians kill each other in a place like Beirut, Lebanon, or that Catholics and Protestants kill each other in a place like Belfast, Northern Ireland, or that Christians like us in Russia don't really agree on some important questions with Orthodox people in Russia. This reassures the unbeliever. The unbeliever likes that. The unbeliever thinks, see there, even these religious fanatics, they can't agree with each other. So how can we know what's really true? They don't even agree with what's true. So you see, this is a great comfort to them. And here's a woman who's just had her private moral life exposed. Now she wants to talk about religious disagreements. Okay, we got a controversy here between the Jews and Samaritans. Let's don't talk about who I sleep with. Let's talk about religious controversy. You see what's happening? A man's morality will always determine his theology, and a man's theology will always determine his morality. They're connected. They're connected. Romans 1 says that unbelievers, they really know what the truth is. They can see it in nature. They can see it in their own conscience. But they suppress the truth. They hold it down. They push it away in unrighteousness. They want to do bad things. And the truth tells them they've got to do what God says, not what they want to do. So they don't want to believe the truth. So this woman says, okay, which is it, the Jews or the Samaritans? Now the interesting thing is that Jesus actually answers her question. He says salvation is of the Jews. The Jews treated the Samaritans terribly. The Jews sinned terribly against the Samaritans. But in terms of the two different versions of Israel's religion, the Jews were right and the Samaritans were wrong. When I tell you that the Samaritans were only looking at the first 5 books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible was divided into 3 sections. Torah, that's law. Ketuvim, that's writings like the Psalms. Navaim, that's the prophets. So there were 3 parts, law, prophets, and writings. The Samaritans said, we don't want to hear anything from the writings or from the prophets. We're just going to concentrate on the first 5 books of the Bible. That's actually what the Sadducees also said. So Jesus is saying, well, you know what? You're really wrong, and the Jews are really right, but that's really not what's important. That's really not what we need to be talking about. Because she asks in verse 20, where should we really worship? Jesus says in verse 21, you know what? A time is coming when no one's going to be able to worship at either of these places. You know, the Romans are going to sweep that religious culture away in about 40 years. And they're also going to destroy the temple. And, you know, the Samaritans know that the Jews burned down their temple 100 years ago. Jesus knows that the Romans are going to burn down the Jewish temple in about 40 years, less than 40 years. Here's what the woman is asking. Where is the external place of worship? Where do we go to worship? Here's the way Jesus begins to answer the question. The external place of worship is not that important. The internal place of worship is important. Where is your spirit? Your spirit is on the inside. Who is God? He's a spirit. How is God to be worshiped? He's to be worshiped spiritually from the inside. Not so much at this mountain or at the temple in Jerusalem, but from the inside out. Now, one reason the Pharisees wanted to kill Jesus was because they had externalized worship. Worship was an external thing that people could see. Jesus said, you know what? It's not. It's an internal thing that God sees. He says, why do you want to wash the outside of the cup and leave the inside of the cup dirty? You see how stupid that is? And he says, you want everybody to see the outside of your life. You don't want anybody to see the inside of your life. You're like a grave that is painted white on the outside, but inside it's full of death. That's what you're like. You paint everything up and keep it clean and gleaming and bright on the outside, but inside you're full of death. And Jesus was always emphasizing the internal realities of worship, the internal realities of godliness. We talked about this when we talked about the Sermon on the Mount. Not just don't kill, but don't be angry. Not just don't commit adultery, but don't be full of lust. It was all there in the Old Testament. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's internal. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's internal. The command to believe is internal. The command to repent is internal. The command to love is internal. The command to rejoice is internal. The command to fear not is internal. See, it doesn't matter if you're keeping the Sabbath in all these little areas, or you're tithing every little piece of the herbs in your garden, if you're not doing all those internal things. So what Jesus does at this point is he begins to teach her about internal worship. She says, I really want to know about external worship. She says, okay, look, a time is coming when you're not going to be able to worship at either place. Then what are you going to do? And then he begins to teach her. In verse 23, the time is coming when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Well, what does that mean in truth? It can mean more than one thing. It can be worship God sincerely. That is true. Are you really worshiping God? When you go to church, do you really worship God, or do you just attend the meeting? Because that's your habit, that's your tradition. Others expect you to do it. It's kind of part of your day on Sunday. Or are you truly worshiping? Are you worshiping sincerely from the inside? Or it can also mean to worship God in the true way. That is, in the way that he prescribes, the way he says he is to be worshiped. Because we can invent our own ways to worship God, which don't even come anywhere near God because they're not the way he's told us to worship. He determines the way he is to be approached by sinners. He gives us the pattern of true worship. So, Jesus amazingly and very, very quickly is teaching these key things. He's making prophecies about the future places of worship. He's teaching her who God is. God is spirit. He's teaching her the way God should be worshiped in spirit and in truth. Now, something dramatic begins to happen now. She says in verse 25, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called the Christ. Now, right there, she's being very, very respectful. Because she's using Jewish terminology. The Samaritans also had a messianic expectation. They didn't call him the Messiah. That's what the Jews call him. They call him the Taheb. She's using Jewish terminology. One thing that missionaries study, and some missionaries disagree about this, what do we call God when we are talking to Muslims? Do we call him God, or do we call him Allah? What do we call Jesus? Do we call him Isa? That's what he's called in the Quran. Or do we call him Jesus? I have my opinions on that, but I've not spent that much time among Muslims in Muslim countries, so my opinion is not worth very much. But she's being very, very respectful. And she says, we Samaritans, we know that the Messiah is coming too. That's something that we believe. And so she introduces the topic. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Well, you know what Jesus has just done? He's told her everything about herself. He told her how many times she's been married. He's told her about the man she's living with. He started to tell her everything about God, who God really is, how God is really and truly worshiped. And he's done it in a breathtakingly short amount of time, in a very, very few words, starting from being a stranger, a suspicious stranger, and now he's become her theological tutor and her spiritual friend. And he did it so fast. And now she says, you know, we know that Messiah is coming. And here's what she's really saying. And we know that when he comes, he'll be a lot like you.
Even a small contribution can make a big difference. Jesus fed 5,000 people because of a little boy's 5 loaves. Regardless of the amount, your contribution is very important and greatly appreciated. Visit us at tvsseminary.com.
Remember what I said before we started to study John 4? I said that if we only had John 4 and we didn't have any other part of the Bible, we could make a powerful argument, I think a very convincing argument, that there's one God who made heaven and earth and Jesus of Nazareth is his son. If we knew enough about the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans in the first century, and we've tried to talk about what those relationships are like. When she said to him, we know that Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he will tell us all things, Jesus responds by saying, that's me. As a matter of fact, now of course we know that he was speaking Aramaic. He wasn't speaking Greek, but we know that the New Testament was written in Greek. And we also know that it's the Greek that's inspired. It's the Greek that gets to the heart of the thing. It's the Greek that the Holy Spirit chose to inscripturate, make canonical the words of Jesus. Do you know that when the Greek translations translate what God said to Moses in the burning bush? Remember what Moses said to God in the burning bush? You got to tell me your name. You can't just send me down there to Moses to say God said, because those Egyptians, to Pharaoh, because those Egyptians, they worship thousands of gods. And as soon as I tell Pharaoh that God said, you got to let these people go, he's going to say, which God? What is his name? So what shall I say his name is? And God said, my name is I Am. Now, the way that's portrayed in Greek with great emphasis and power is ego eimi. So when John translates, or when John writes in Greek what Jesus says to that woman says to Jesus, we're expecting the Messiah. We know that Messiah is coming. We know that when he comes, he'll tell us all things. Lege ate hai Jesus. Then Jesus said to her, ego eimi. I am. He said the very same thing that God said to Moses in the bush. And then he says, I who speak to you am he. Now, why is that so important? And why do I say that it has great apologetic value? And why do I say that it offers us great proof that Jesus really is the Messiah of Israel, that he really is the Son of God, that these accounts are really true and they're not made up? Well, let me now develop that argument. Who are the Jews? The Jews are the rejects of the world. They're the people that other peoples of the earth look down on. Very soon, a few years after this, the Emperor Claudius or Tiberius, I think Claudius, will throw the Jews out of Rome. Aquila and Priscilla got thrown out of Rome in that development. Well, yeah, everybody looks down on the Jews, but the Jews, they look down on somebody too. They look down on the Samaritans. Who do the Samaritans look down on? Well, you know what? Samaritan men look down on Samaritan women. I'm afraid that in the ancient Near East, the men treated the women like second-class citizens. As a matter of fact, there's an Orthodox Jewish prayer that's still prayed today by some Orthodox Jews. And the prayer goes something like this: Dear God, I thank you that I'm not a Gentile. I thank you that I'm not a slave. And I thank you that I'm not a woman. It's pretty brutal, isn't it? So the men look down on the women. Well, here's a question. Where does that leave the Samaritan women? They're pretty low, aren't they? I mean, the whole world looks down on the Jews, and the Jews look down on the Samaritans, and the Samaritan men look down on the Samaritan women. Who do the Samaritan women look down on? You know who they look down on? They look down on this woman. You know how I know that? Isn't it interesting that John told us what time it was? Remember? Jesus is waiting at the well. It's the 6th hour. That's 12 noon. You know what? Women don't go to the well at 12 noon. They go to the well in the early morning or in the early evening when it's cool. And you know what? Women don't go to the well alone. They go in groups. She went to the well at noon. She went to the well alone. Why? Because no woman wanted to go to the well with her. They didn't want to be seen with her. She'd been married 5 times. Oh, and she's now living with a man that she's not married to. That's not a big deal today. It was really a big deal back then, though. The world looked down on the Jews looked down on the Samaritans, the Samaritan men looked down on the Samaritan women, the Samaritan women looked down on this woman. She's the lowest of the low. She is the lowest of the low. You know what John 4:26 is? Ego eimi. I am. I who speak to you am He. I am the Messiah. You know what that is? That is the fullest self-disclosure of the messianic identity in the Bible. The only thing that comes close is Jesus' response to Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi in Matthew 16. That's the only thing that even comes close. But I would argue that this is a greater self-disclosure than that. But that's the only thing that comes close. And He made the disclosure to a Samaritan woman. Now, let me tell you what the rabbis were teaching in the generation of Jesus. There's something called the Talmud. The Talmud is not the Bible. The Talmud is the Jewish commentary on the Bible, on the Hebrew Bible. The Talmud is composed of the sayings and traditions and commentary of the rabbis. The Talmud was collected after the generation of Jesus, but the Talmud reflected ancient ideas which would be current with the generation of Jesus. Let me quote from the Talmud. This is not the Bible. This is not Torah. This is the Talmud, the Jewish commentary on the Bible. I'm going to share 3 quotes with you. First quote: the man who teaches Torah to a woman plays the fool. A man is a fool to teach the Bible to a woman. That's the first quote. Second quote, better to burn Torah than to teach it to a woman. It's better to set the Bible on fire than to teach it to a woman. Third quote, do not speak to a woman in public, no, not to your own wife. That's what rabbis were supposed to do, and that's what rabbis were not supposed to do in the generation of Jesus of Nazareth. So, he gives the fullest self-disclosure of his messianic identity to a woman, not just any woman, but a Samaritan woman. Not just any Samaritan woman, but an immoral Samaritan woman. Do you think this was made up? Do you think a human being could have thought of this? Do you think a Jew in the first century could have imagined this? You know why we know Jesus of Nazareth was not invented? Because he couldn't have been imagined. You've got to imagine something before you can invent it. If you can't imagine it, you can't invent it. He couldn't be imagined, much less invented. Remember what I tell you at first. Because we know the stories, they don't shock us. Because we know them. Remember we talked about counterintuitiveness. Do you realize how counterintuitive this thing is, what he just did? The even fact that he would talk to her, much less the thing he told her. When the disciples came back, they were shocked out of their mind. They couldn't even believe he was talking to her. What if they'd known what he told her? So ends this session. We'll finish it in the next session.